I'm very certain that all of you are aware of Warframe being joked about as being a farming simulator. However, considering that the big 3 open-world zones we've received are still basically their own separate areas of play, I would call it fair to say that Warframe is the equivalent of one giant rice field. But instead of water, or railjack, connecting everything together, it's just grind.
The next station will be Fortuna 69.
It is finished. You are now gay.
Hello again, ladies and gentlemen. Yes, I am aware that my audience is a borderline sausage fest, but unless all of you are fine with collectively being referred to as gentlemen, this is what I will go with. Anyways, here we are nearing the end of 2020. Raids have been gone for almost 1,000 days. Heart of Deimos was launched, much to the delight of simps everywhere. And Warframe content on YouTube is now just basically a contest between everyone over who can make the strongest builds with the Helminth system first before they get inevitably nerfed. Honestly, at this point, that's to be expected, even though that wasn't always the case. Some of you might remember there was a time long ago in Warframe where it was considered a challenge or even impressive to go into Tier 4 survival solo and stay there for at least 40 minutes. Fast forward a few years later, and now we stand at a point where basically any Warframe now can hit at least an hour of survival solo thanks to the Helminth system. Test servers have finally been implemented, but only used twice as of making this video, and the existence of the simulacrum was almost threatened after D.E. Scott made his dislike of it very known.
What, in your, experience has been the biggest bollock when it comes to making, game development side of things for Warframe, whether it's, the balance changes or balancing a new Warframe or dealing with us idiots like us, all that kind of stuff. Like, what would you has been, in your experience, the biggest bollock when you're kind of doing your game dev stuff?
Well, I guess the biggest thing recently is the simulacrum in Warframe. I absolutely hate that room, and here's why. It's because we put out an update, and you go look at all of our content creators and all of our champions, and they're all sitting in this gray room, John, shooting things that don't move, staring at the numbers, going, "Is that good? I don't know." That's what everyone does, and that's what people use to validate all of these crazy things. And it's like, okay, I get that it's an easy place to quickly jump between your arsenal and experiment with builds, and I get that. But I goddamn hate that, like, there's probably a large portion of our YouTube content out there that's this goddamn box room, silver gray room.
Yeah, it's not showing off the actual game then.
Yeah.
Brain dead AI, and you're just staring at the numbers, and it just drives me nuts, because the game is so rich in artistic content, and the game plays so much different than that room when people start sending me that as this is look how easy the game is, look at what I can do, when there's 15 bombards all piled together in one spot. It's like, that doesn't happen in the actual game ever.
Obviously, I'm not a game developer, nor do I sit in the simulacrum all day, jerking off to high damage numbers and datasheets. However, as somebody with common sense, maybe the reason why a large chunk of Warframe content on YouTube nowadays is just Red Crit God Nuke build and other similar stuff is because the last few years have been power creeped the ever-loving shit out of the game. There is not a single person out there dumb enough to think that the simulacrum represents the entirety of Warframe. Does Warframe revolve heavily around damage now? Yes. Does it help that Riven mods were added to the game ages ago? No. Does it help that we now also have the Helminth system? No. Does it help that brain-dead AI has always been a thing, even on Steel Path? No. Even with all of that in mind, the average person learning about Warframe for the first time is not dumb enough to think that Warframe can be completely represented by footage of people camping in a room designed to test damage numbers. All you have to do is look at how many people out there have made a review about Warframe, or how many times DE sponsored somebody to make a Warframe video. In my opinion, if you have the resources to sponsor multiple high-profile content creators on YouTube to make a video talking about your game, then you have absolutely zero excuse to say that the simulacrum is bad because everyone on YouTube does it. Therefore, people will think that's what Warframe is about. If you ask me, DE getting mad at their players and/or content creators for using the simulacrum for exactly what it was designed for means two things. Either A, they dislike their own players making nothing but simulacrum videos showing off builds because that gives off the idea that Warframe revolves entirely around damage, which can negatively affect their precious game's public image. Or B, they dislike the popularity of build videos on YouTube because it implies that the best way to play Warframe is to do it in a specific way with specific things, thereby turning away any potential new players exposed to Warframe for the first time. Take your pick. The closest thing that Warframe has ever had to content that somewhat requires players to work together and learn mechanics to progress, instead of just shooting the problem away, was raids. And those were removed years ago, temporarily, according to DE. You can also make an argument that Eidolon hunts and the Orb boss fights on Fortuna also somewhat require players to work together. But Nash Prime exists, so I personally disagree with this idea. So what does any of this have to do with content islands in Warframe? All jokes aside, besides the sheer amount of grinding to be done in Warframe, really the only thing that connects everything together, so to speak, in Warframe, is the player's own gear. I'm sure you all know how Kuva Liches were supposed to be connected to Railjack, and Railjack was supposed to be the great big update that would have linked everything, allowing players to seamlessly go from being planet-side on Fortuna to outer space. I'm sure you also know how both of those turned out to be a total crock of shit. So, with both of the hyped updates not being quite as what was advertised, what else is there to somewhat connect everything together besides grind and player gear? It's true that a new player can completely ignore the planes of Eidolon, Fortuna, and Deimos zones, and they would miss out on a handful of Warframes, mods, Zors, kit guns, companions, and a few side quests. But would it affect the player's experience of Warframe entirely? Yes and no. Ignoring the open world zones wouldn't affect the player's experience with the main story of Warframe, because according to DE themselves, literally none of the main story quests require any of the open world zones to be unlocked. At the same time, ignoring the open world zones would somewhat affect the player's experience with the gameplay of Warframe, because doing so would prevent access to Zors, kit guns, K-drives, mining and fishing resources, which are sometimes used to craft equipment, arcanes, and a handful of Warframes and side quests. However, that really only matters if a player isn't willing or capable of spending platinum to just buy all of those things and ignore the grind altogether. But given that Warframe is heavily marketed towards casual players, it's safe to say that the vast majority of new players would spend little, if anything, when it comes to obtaining new gear that could otherwise be grinded for. We wouldn't be sitting here grinding in isolated areas of the game if DE had some proper manpower behind their vision. I'm well aware that they've recently been bought by Tencent, but ignoring that, this has been the vicious cycle of Warframe. New big content is announced, the players get excited, the content launches, the players get mad about something with the content. DE flips a coin and either compromises or does nothing. The players forget about it. The content becomes forgotten. Rinse, wash, and repeat. Some people have said that at this point, Duviri Paradox will simply be an Orokin-themed open world. And while I don't disagree with that belief, I disagree with the belief that all new pieces of content should be mainline story quests, isolated farming spots, or new equipment. All of which rounds back to the age-old question. What is the end game of Warframe? Grind? Fashion frame? Min-maxing? Honestly, you can pick whatever answer you want as long as it isn't the Conclave, and you would still arrive at the same conclusion. With the amount of grind there is in Warframe, and the amount of gear available to players that can be very easily upgraded or enhanced, it only makes sense that a player would want to look for the most powerful, most efficient, or the most easy-to-use builds to make progressing through the game as little of a chore as possible. Because after all, grind is one of the biggest constants of Warframe. There's a reason why build videos are as popular as they are for Warframe. And there's a reason why DE are so quick to nerf anything that suddenly pops up as excessively trivializing the game. Even when gear that's already excessively strong exists. And honestly, it's DE's fault. We, as the players, have become laughably strong over the past few years of grinding and acquiring better weapons and warframes, and now DE has to constantly develop content while simultaneously accounting for how overpowered we can be. Even with Steel Path, difficulty in Warframe boils down to raising enemy level and damage without doing anything towards their AI or how they actually behave. Meaning that most enemies you fight in the game are nothing more than simple bullet sponges. At the same time, there's no real reason to fight against very high-level enemies, because although enemy armor and level increases, the amount of loot and rewards you get is the same. Meaning that doing things such as 12-hour solo survival or something along those lines is mostly just a flex about doing a world record or something, not to actually farm anything. At the end of the day, all of us are just trying to distract ourselves with pointless memes and grind until the next big update comes out, which will inevitably be more of the same stuff we've been doing for the last 5 years. I don't think that Warframe will die out anytime soon. But if you ask me, continuing with a horse and carrot philosophy will only make the game feel more repetitive than it should be. Unless Warframe 2 comes out in 2035. Those are just my thoughts. Take care of yourselves, be excellent to each other, and as always, thank you for watching.